Hello everyone and welcome back to the Future Tech for Education series on the Edtech Podcast. This week we are looking at personalised learning. Personalised learning can mean different things to different people, taking in everything from technical platforms such as adaptive learning to pedagogical concepts such as flipped classrooms to simply a more learner-led approach. Let's say what it's safely not is 30 children in a mixed ability class all turning over the page at the same time. In the last weeks of 2017, the concept of personalised learning went through some interesting evolutions. First up, math blogger Dan Mayer and EdSurge columnist Mary Jo Madder put out an excellent podcast questioning the core assumptions of personalised learning with math. Next, EdWeek staff writer Benjamin Herold ran an article entitled The Cases Against Personalised Learning, which investigated the confusing context around this mammoth term and the limited evidence yet garnered to support its often advocated game-changer potential. It's against this backdrop that I spoke to Dr. Kristen DiCerbo, VP of Education Research at Pearson, about her findings on personalised learning. We spoke about her take on what exact practices form personalised learning, and for each of these practices, how learners, teachers and technology might work together to create a more individualised learning experience. Here's our catch-up. This is a bit of a special recording because I'm actually here with Kristen DiCerbo in person in Holborn at the Kingsway Hotel on an early AM on Friday. So we made it to the end of the week. Yay. And this episode's all about personalised learning. So what does an evidence-based approach to personalised learning look like? In the last weeks of 2017, the concept of personalised learning have gone through some interesting evolution. So I noticed that for example, on the EdSurge podcast, math blogger Dan Mayer and EdSurge columnist Mary Jo Madder were questioning the core assumptions around personalised learning with math, for example. But I wanted to kind of get into a little bit about the various interpretations of what personalised learning is. So first up, what's personalised learning in your view, Kristen?
You're absolutely right to say that there's a lot of question about what people mean by personalised learning. Essentially, as I see it, it is tailoring instruction to the individual needs, values, and interests of a particular student. So that can mean a lot of different things. It can mean that we use technology to help support that and to scale that, but it can also mean that it's the student driving their own choices and bringing their own agency into the learning process. And it can mean that the teacher or the instructor in the classroom is thinking about how to adjust instruction for a particular student.
As I understand that you've done a bit of research around this, that being your role as well and with that of your team. But before we get into sort of the practices that research show sort of uphold the best practice in personalised learning, what's the evidence behind personalised learning and how it's actually sort of a positive step for education as well?
It's interesting because as with many things we see in education, sometimes the hype starts to outpace the evidence that we have. So there's been just recently some new efforts to pin down the evidence for personalized learning. The RAND Corporation came out with a big report that looked at the effectiveness of personalized learning generally. But the biggest thing that stood out to me in that report was they actually listed the effects by the different schools. So they looked at a whole bunch of different schools that were implementing personalized learning. And the effects went from quite positive to actually seeing some negative effects for personalized learning. And so to me, just taking then the average and saying, oh, this is the effect of personalized learning, really covers up a lot of that variability. And so I think what we need to look at when we start talking about evidence is, well, what are those things that the schools that were successful were doing? And what were those things that the schools weren't as successful were doing? So we can think about, again, starting to dive into what are the pieces of personalized learning that do impact in a positive way that we want to implement, and what are maybe the parts of the personalized learning that we've tried and don't make as much of a difference, and we don't use them and we can kind of abandon those.
So Kristen, you were telling me about some of the practices that make personalized learning perhaps more beneficial than, if we just have a go at it, essentially.
Yeah, so I think that we can use what we know from education research already to think about what practices do we know are effective and what are the ones that really help us individualize instruction. So if we think about feedback, for example, we know from decades of research that giving students immediate feedback or feedback at the appropriate time is really important for learning. So from a personalization perspective, we can think about how do we make sure we're really tailoring that feedback to that particular student in that particular context, and think about how we adapt some of these practices that we know to be effective to more individualizing that instruction for students.
And we spoke also about, how do you scale that? Because then if I'm giving feedback to you and it's very personalized and, I've got 30 kids in my class or more, how do you actually make that effective without it being a complete drainer on the teacher as well?
Really, the ability to scale this idea of personalization has been historically, I think, the kind of barrier to doing it was how can you do it for very many students? And it has to be technology that enables it. That's the way I think that we can really break through that issue of scale. So we can think about now with artificial intelligence that I know you've touched on in past podcasts, and thinking about how we can bring some of the elements of a human tutoring experience into our technology, thinking about what are the key elements of feedback. So identifying what are those pieces that we need then to tailor it to the student. Is it being knowledgeable about not just their current performance, but their past performance, also potentially bringing in their goals and where we know they want to get to, so we can provide the feedback in a way that's personal to them.
Okay, and so that's the feedback side of it. And are there any other categories that people should look out for as well?
There certainly are. We can actually think about examining kind of the whole teaching and learning cycle. So if you think about starting off with a teacher of determining what the students' needs are, and thinking about using technology potentially to be able to gather and store that information about students, not just achievement, but goals and interests and information about, behaviors and all of that, to help the teacher have access to information about all of their students. Because even the best teacher, once you get, beyond 20 students or so, it's really hard to keep all of that information mentally. So thinking about determining students' needs, we can certainly think about student profiles and using technology to help teachers track and create those. Then we can think about, now that we know what the students' needs are, planning instruction. And so starting to, again, think about what are the activities that teachers are going to design and build that help personalize learning. So we often talk about this idea of low threshold and high ceiling tasks. And those are activities where students can access them at various levels of achievements. So thinking about planning those activities. And then finally, in delivering them, we get to things like adaptive testing, so that students can take fewer assessment items, but we can still get good information about what they're doing. So all of those kind of together can help us build technology that personalizes the experience.
But what are the cases against personalised learning? The recent Education Week article I mentioned previously listed the 3 cases against personalised learning as:
Argument 1. The hype outweighs the research.
The evidence base is very weak at this point. Indeed, a 2017 report by Silicon Schools, a major investor in personalised learning, stated in its opening paragraphs, "We do not believe that there is yet definitive proof that personalised learning works better than other models. Ultimately, we hope that personalised learning will improve life outcomes for students, with clear evidence to support its efficacy. In the interim, we look to traditional academic measures to provide early signs of the efficacy of personalised learning."
Argument 2. Personalised learning is bad for teachers and students.
The modularisation of personalised learning can take away the agency of students and teachers. There is a disconnect between the type of self-directed, passionate learning envisaged in Todd Rose's The End of Average and the recognition of more social, dynamic learning outside of screen time.
Argument 3. Big tech plus big data equals big problems.
When Facebook promises personalisation, it's really about massive data collection, says Audrey Waters of Hack Education. A layman's understanding of big data and machine learning recognises the need for more information in to improve automated services out. In this new social contract where data is the currency, we have seen the limitations, from everything to how cryptocurrency rallies to how elections are won by online profiling. But what are the implications of this with student data? So, identifying what personalised learning is and measuring its effectiveness is still a work in process. Working out what role the student, software and teacher have is still in development. And working out how much data we should supply, by when and to whom is still in the balance. So, personalised learning definitely still is a work in development, yet the idea of being able to do things at your own pace certainly seems reasonable. I've been at once frustrated by not being able to get ahead in certain learning situations, whilst feeling anxious at not quite grasping a concept in others. But limited collection of impact evidence, the collection of big data, and the role of computers and teachers still needs finessing and to be considered in detail by educators and administrators. Here's Kristen again. With all this research now, is this kind of currently embedded in existing personalised learning techniques and technologies, or is it something that's going to sort of come online in 2018, 2019?
I think it's still the future in many cases. And I think there's a couple things that as we're building that future, we need to be thinking about. One is the balance between the technology and the teacher and the student, and who's making the decisions, what is the balance between who's deciding what to do next? And does the technology just make recommendations, or does it actually guide the instruction? Does the teacher make recommendations? How much control does the student have? So I think there are still questions to be answered as we are moving forward, and we're not quite there yet, but we're certainly on the path right now.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's always the debate, isn't it? The balance between those three. You mentioned there's more research to be done. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what that might look like?
Yeah, one way that helps me think about organizing all of the myriad of questions that we might be asking is to kind of think of them in groups. And so I often think if we're going to personalize learning, we kind of need 4 building blocks of personalization. So one is we need what I think of as the map of where the student wants to go. So if you can imagine the map, there's many different paths to get to a certain destination, and any particular student might be on a different path. But you have to have some sense of what that map looks like. And so that in research is understanding the knowledge and skills and how students develop those knowledge and skills. What are the paths that students go on to come to an understanding of whatever topics we're interested in. Second, you need to continue the metaphor, would be the "you are here" stamp, which is understanding where the students are right now. And so that really involves a lot of assessment, which doesn't have to be formal and scary and tests, but some indication to know what are the students' current knowledge and skills and interests and all of that. From there, we need to know, all right, how do we move the student forward? How does the student move themselves forward so that they can make progress on that path? And then finally, the fourth one really we can think about as maybe in this metaphor is Siri, the guidance to the student of how to get there. So I think each of those areas has research questions in it, but are the kind of blocks we need to individualize the path for a student.
And from a researcher's perspective, where is personalised learning really taking off? So where are you seeing this actually being embedded in a very interesting way?
Yeah, I think the first places we've seen it have been in intelligent tutoring systems. And so in some ways, those have done a good job at some of the points, like creating a profile of the student's achievement and then delivering particular activities or problems that are in a good place at the right level for that student. They've been good at that. What they haven't been as good at sometimes is actually including more about the student than just their achievement. Second, allowing the student to have some agency in terms of what they're doing. And then third, some of the instructional practices intelligent tutors continue to be, well, if you don't get it right, we'll keep asking you that question. You can give me the same calculus question over and over, and I'm still not going to be able to solve it. So we need to think a little bit more when I was talking about those building blocks on that third one of how do we move the student ahead more effectively.
But what does personalised learning look like to an educator? Is it really about the software? I spoke to a teacher and school leader in the UK to find out what personalised learning meant to him. Here's Richard Fulford, Head of Science at the Latymer School in the UK and current user of DiCerbo, an adaptive learning programme designed to boost students' performance in science exams. I couldn't help but notice that Richard got an exemplary score on Rate My Teachers with the testimonial, "He's actually really nice, get on his good side and actually try and he'll really like you." Today's all about personalised learning. So first question, what does personalised learning mean to you?
Okay, so I think personalised learning has a sort of spectrum of terms. For me, it's not necessarily about one teacher providing 32 separate lesson plans and different activities for students, which it's been interpreted that way in some schools, some institutions, that it really must be completely personalised, where no two students have the same learning experience. I think it's a little bit sort of dialed back from that. Some of the earlier definitions of personalised learning were a bit better. I think just where a teacher understands the needs of a student, responds to them, be that through giving them a different worksheet or just spending some time reinforcing some ideas for them, checking they've understood it, making sure that if their example, I mean, it's a trite example, but a sort of English as an additional language student, making sure they can access the question, making sure they've got whatever they need in order to sort of understand the point you're trying to make. And then the progress is largely governed by how well the students do on those things, how quickly they move on to other things. And those are all done as a response from the teacher to the student. I think it might be slightly easier to say what personalised learning isn't, and it's not going on to the sort of shared area for your department, pulling off presentation number 5, standing at the front and clicking through the slides. I think that's the opposite, and that's what it was designed, I feel, to eradicate as teaching, where we should be more responsive. Sometimes I feel people have taken it slightly too far in terms of this extreme individual differentiation, which is incredibly, I mean, it would be wonderful, be absolutely wonderful if it were possible, but I don't feel that that's the wisest use of a teacher's time to plan 32 different lessons 6 times a day. I don't think that's what it is either. I think it sits somewhere in the middle, being teaching which is responsive to the needs and abilities of the student, so that they can make as much progress as possible.
So based on that, I mean, you mentioned before you've moved schools sort of within the last 2 years. When did you start to develop sort of personalised learning techniques as you take them? And how did you go about implementing that as well?
Okay, so a lot of it happened in sort of the last 2 or 3 years at the school I was at in Kent. We abandoned setting for science at GCSE, and we're going towards more mixed ability, which meant that people would make very different progress throughout a lesson based on ability, and you couldn't have a one-size-fitting-all approach if you ever could. But I mean, we sort of, as a school, as a leadership group, sort of tried to move away from this sharing of resources so that you could make more personalised stuff. Now, it's very difficult if you're a new member of staff or an NQT who hasn't yet established a sort of array of strategies that work for different things for different students on different tasks. But it was more suggesting a range of these things, getting you to think about the students that you were going to be teaching and which ones would fit them best, which ones could you just adapt. And we went as a group in science and across the school a big move away from this. There shouldn't be a set rock hard scheme of work that says in this half hour in this lesson you're going to be doing this activity, which is what some heads of departments still dream of, this sort of very tightly governed approach to a scheme of work that will be followed through at a specific rate. It sounds like this sort of Gina Ford of teaching and learning. No, it's a very planning minute by minute. Yeah, it's that idea of sort of over planning. Yes, you've got to plan for disruption perhaps in your schools. Yeah, you've got to plan for other people going faster. It's not necessarily having a set plan for them, but being able to respond to them with some ideas of how to stretch them. So not individual tasks to extend them, but strategies that you can sort of ask more difficult questions of to spark more sort of high-level conversations or higher-level questions. If you've got a bank of resources that you know, oh, that book's got that difficult question on that, or the student's struggling with the maths bit, I've got that over there. Again, I do feel that it's very difficult and something you need time to build up so that you can personalise it. You've got to have a range of tasks to do it. But that was really where we started, differentiating the lessons. I think the personalised learning bit, we moved to a bit of IT to do really in science, the extreme personalisation. And what was the IT that you used to sort of take on that part of the task? So we used a bit of software called Tassami within science. It covers a lot of factual content of the specifications that we were using, and it's multiple choice. So it hits sort of assessment objective 1, which is knowledge and understanding, and it does that in a truly adaptive way that I don't think a teacher would be able to do for homework. We used that as sort of 50% of our homework was students to go on, log in, click through some multiple choice questions, which, if you got a question right, broadly speaking, the questions on that topic got harder, and that topic was revisited less frequently. If you got a question on that topic wrong, the questions got easier, and they were sort of repeated, or you saw that topic more often in your quizzes, by which point no one was doing exactly the same as everyone else. Everyone was getting completely personalised, differentiated online continuous assessment homework. And that was really quite nice to be able to set not necessarily personalised learning in lessons completely, but certainly personalised homework. That was very nice. Students responded quite well to that.
So that's quite interesting. So the sort of personalised aspect of what you're doing, to some extent, where it does become more adaptive, was in the homework setting. So that brings on to the next question, really, which was, considering personalisation or personalised learning, what do you think the role of the teacher is? Because there's been some criticism that, it can lead to sort of silent classrooms or students sat in front of banks of computers. So it's quite interesting to see your take on, how you're using it and where you're also not using it.
Yes, I think it's very useful in providing sort of assessment data, formative assessment data to allow you to move on. Would I introduce a topic by sitting people down and getting them to click through multiple choice questions on a new topic? No, I wouldn't. I would sort of use more, I suppose, traditional ideas of that. They've got to get the information somehow. Again, you get a choice as a teacher as to whether you're going to deliver that by some amazing immersive game that you read about on tests that someone's invented, whether you go through it on the board in a traditional way, or whether you've got sort of smaller chunk tasks to do it. Again, you've got a multiple sort of toolkit available, but I wouldn't necessarily use that completely personalised approach, because that means you're going back to this sort of 32 lesson plan thing. So yes, you're going to have different ways of explaining and introducing a topic, but you might not know until the lesson how they're going to respond. I can tell you that one group will take to one activity really well, and you'll repeat it with your next year 10 group, and it will go appallingly. There isn't a set formula for this will work with your students at this time. Are you changing how you teach based on the time of the day, for example? Do I teach differently Friday afternoon to Tuesday morning? Yes, I probably do. Again, is that personalised to me as a teacher? I'm just sort of spitballing ideas there. But no, I wouldn't necessarily use software to introduce a topic. You could get them to log on to an online textbook if you think so the textbook is the best method at that point, if you think they've got a really nice page on it, certainly. But to use the personalised learning all the time, it sort of depersonalises it.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's a kind of software development side of things, and then there's the actual personalised approach to teaching that teachers deploy every day of the week, I suppose, and being adaptive to what's going on in the classroom in front of you.
Yeah, the idea of sort of adaptive teaching. Is adaptive teaching personalised learning? Is it all good differentiation? Is it good assessment for learning in the classroom? I don't know if personalised learning just turns out to be good teaching, whereby you respond to the needs of the students in front of you and help them make progress. At one end of the spectrum, I think that possibly is what was meant by personalised learning, just responding to the people in your class and helping them move forward in whatever way that is.
I suppose one differentiation of those two ideas is the role of data. For example, in many of the what are deemed as truly personalised learning platforms, there would be some form of machine learning or AI to understand the data points of students and respond accordingly. So I don't know to what extent with the personalised learning systems that you've used, there's that role of data, and also how you kind of manage that, because obviously to some extent the more data you have, the more personalised and adaptive a system can be. But the other area around it is to what extent we are comfortable with that. So I just wondered your thoughts on what you've experienced there.
That's an interesting one, from being a classroom teacher right the way up to dealing with data on a leadership level. You can certainly gather data on free school meals, ethnicity, literacy level, any SEN you've got. However, the profile you build in your Excel spreadsheet of joy may may not really equal the person that you see on a Thursday lunchtime. There, so again, the data is fine, but you as a teacher have got to sort of have an understanding of your student beyond the spreadsheet, regardless of the subgroups that they fall into. They may just be a well-behaved student. They may be a badly behaved student who you need to work with. Behaviour is very rarely recorded in any sort of data that's there. There's another viewpoint is, do I need any data other than their progress so far? As a teacher, do I teach everyone the same just based on their understanding at this point? If they're making slower progress, is there something I can do? Is it an EAL student we've had students who have sort of come in from Afghanistan with 2 months of spoken English and they're going to need some sort of literacy help to access things? Yes, that's helpful to know. I wouldn't get that information just by looking at their last test score. That is quite helpful to know if you're going to put anything in place like that, which again, differentiation is personalising it to an extent. My other big thing on data is you can have all as much as you like in terms of school processed data and test results, grade boundaries on your last test. How are they doing in your sort of scheme of assessment? How do you know how good it is? What's your test for this? Were they in the last group that sat the test? Have 4 people told them what's in it beforehand? Is what you're seeing in the spreadsheet wholly reliable? Are you gambling if you're planning a lesson based on it? So I think that the amount of data that's available needs a degree of skepticism, might be the wrong word, but a degree of personalised context, actually knowing the person that you're going to be teaching. That's often more valuable than knowing of their reading age when they were 12 or something along those lines.
That's very interesting. And would you have any tips for other SLT listeners on how to embed an effective personalised learning approach? I know that can mean different things to different people in different schools, but making sure that you're aware of those contexts that you mentioned there, as well as just deploying the sort of the EdTech that might enable it.
From leadership, but when you're working with departments that you're responsible for, I think they need to have access to the data so they can start looking at potential trends and people that need more support. I think from an intervention level, certainly that data needs to be shared with them so you can put in place support to help the students who are identified as underperforming for whatever reason. And then in terms of a teaching point of view, just checking with your head department, and then even going to the teachers in the classroom. Perhaps, again, this might the darker side of leadership is, do you always trust what you're being told by your head department? Oh yeah, we're doing the personalised learning. How are you doing that? It's sometimes a bit harder to ask those questions of the people that you're working with. But show me the evidence. Let's go for a learning walk. What am I going to see? Am I going to see the personalised learning? What does it look like to you? Ask them in meetings. What does personalised learning mean to you? Is it the same as those 10 guys thought it meant at the SLT meeting on Tuesday or whatever? Is your message, is what they think personalised learning the same as you? And again, ask, do the teachers have a bank of resources, or are they going in with one thing? If you're in a school that demands lesson planning, if you're looking at those lesson plans, how prescriptive are they? How much flexibility is there to respond to students in that? From a work scrutiny perspective, especially in science, that there can be notes. Are all the students' books the same? If so, your learning's not personalised. Don't get me wrong, students may be making outstanding progress, and if they are, that's important. But if they're all looking the same, there's likely to be some people who could make more and some people who are making less, but are just covering it with sort of note copying. So those are some of the ways to sort of ensure that those, just monitoring that it's going on. And again, go back to basics, just talking to students, student voice, talking to staff. What would you do if this situation happened? CPD sessions on how you can respond to things going wrong in a lesson, or students not understanding something in a question. I think one of the things we've really focused on at Latymer is not focusing on the activities people are doing, but making sure they're sort of getting the objectives there, and however they get there is how they get there. You're just there to respond to them in lessons, not force the next activity on, because that's what you said you were going to do with 20 minutes left of your lesson. Seeing people adapt and respond to students is much more progress making and much more sort of assuring from an educational point of view than the lesson plan being followed.
Final question. Is there a person, place and or a project that has had an impact on your thinking? So that can be in relation to this or just in relation to, how you approach education more generally, I suppose.
Interesting. Well, I was sort of thinking about this and I've done it in a personalised learning context. I think there's two people that have amazed me in terms of personalised learning. One was a deputy head that I worked with as a maths teacher with an incredible encyclopedic knowledge of about the 7 different textbooks of questions she could use at any one point. So she was able to walk into a room and say, you're going to do these questions, you're going to do these questions, you're going to do these questions based on your homework, and just sort of knew instinctively was able to help those students work on their areas of development just by sheer knowledge of the resources she had. It was quite impressive to walk in and see that happening. Again, that wasn't necessarily planned in terms of writing it down and doing it. She was just able to do it instinctively. I guess one of the sort of natural born teachers with a wide repertoire and a good experience of different question styles. That was incredibly impressive to watch. And the other one I would have to say is sometimes the creators and programmers of these things. So as a school, we've worked with TASMI to try and work out how they do things and produce the data for us on where students are. So I suppose some of the guys there, Dan and Murray Morrison, designing the algorithms, the adaptive learning stuff, that's really quite admirable. That's inspiring, and hopefully if schools continue to teach coding and maths as well as some of them do, where the next generation are going to sort of eat and drink online, really, sort of this self-adaptive edtech is really quite powerful. So those are the projects I admire, being able to provide staff with massive amounts of data, not on their background, but on their abilities in certain areas, so we can help them out as much as we can do.
And if people are listening in, Richard, and they would like to connect with what you're doing and follow your work, are you on Twitter, or is there any other way to keep track of what you're up to? I
do have a LinkedIn profile, which is just Richard Fulford, and you'll be able to find me on there. But there's also a little bit of a website. So I'm part of the Enfield Teaching Schools Alliance, working with some other schools in Enfield and in other London boroughs, and we sort of update the website with what we've been doing there. Failing that, the Latymer School Twitter account is always rife with updates and teaching and learning news. But I suppose those are the main ways of getting in contact.
Thanks, Richard. That's the end of this week's episode. Thank you to all this week's guests, and do join us next week to hear about the power of co-creating educational games. Want to leave feedback? Tweet us at Podcast Edtech and at Kristen DiCerbo, or check out the Pearson Podcast page at tinyurl.com/Pearson Future Tech, where you can also find more content, reports and insight. I'll drop that link, show notes and more at theedtechpodcast.com.
Throughout human history, one of our big successes has been the development of more and more technology.
The AI-based design company seems to be at a distinct disadvantage.
And that what is an application of skills and knowledge at a moment in time.
What should the humans do versus what should you let technology do?
We are so trained to fear AI.
They have enormous computing resources and the latest AI technology on their side.
So as educators, we have to stop and say, how do we approach this?
It's so cool that we can get students to engage with computations and so on.
Everybody's got to be in the learning business.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more on AI, languages, gaming, assessment without tests and personalised learning, make sure you subscribe to the Edtech Podcast on iTunes, where you can also leave a review. Thanks for listening in, and we look forward to hearing your own future tech for education related stories.